Alright, so we've got some great news for PvE players. Dune Awakening's endgame features a lot of content that can be done without actually engaging in PvP. We've got a big gameplay reveal showing the deep desert having a massive PvE area, more ways to collect spices, and lots more. So we're gonna break all of that down in this video and let's jump right in. So let's get started with the endgame and PvP, because this has been a major point of concern for newcomers who may be put off by the idea of having to constantly fight with other players. Well, guess what? You totally don't have to do that. In fact, Funcom recently showed that there are many ways in which you can still be successful in the end game by purely focusing on PvE. And one of the ways in which you can do that also includes the deep desert, because the moment you load in the deep desert, the very first area you go into is the shield wall, and this whole area over here is purely just PvE, and it's also absolutely massive. They showed a little bit of it. It stretches for over 24 kilometers, pretty much covering the whole southern region of the deep desert. So there's definitely a lot of space over here, and it's also extremely populated with a lot of high-end encounters, a lot of endgame shipwrecks, ecological sites, and according to Funcom, also some smaller pockets of spice. So we're gonna have a lot more ways to acquire spice, not just the massive spice blows. On a similar note, we also have to talk about the weekly reset, aka the Coriolis Storm. So this is basically what's going to completely reshuffle everything in the deep desert every week. According to Funcom, this is going to happen every Tuesday to Wednesday. At least that's the plan right now. And it's not just that the maps will get fully reset and you're going to have to rediscover them again, but also the contents and the activities inside of them will get reshuffled into new locations. So they gave a few examples over the span of a few weeks. For example, this area right here in the first week was showing a shipwreck, an eco lab, and a couple of spice blows. Quick side note, by the way, it definitely seems to be possible for one single area of the deep desert to feature multiple spice blows, which is quite reassuring. But in the next week, things can change dramatically. Now objectives appear in completely different spots, and maybe even completely new objectives emerge from beneath the sands, such as, for example, new control points and whatnot. And the same the week after, and so on and so forth. So all of this over here is random. Not every tile will be as populated each week, but guess what? The deep desert is made out of 81 such tiles / maps as the one that you see right here. So this is exactly the reason why I fully believe that even for smaller guilds or ones that fully engage just in PvE, there's still a lot of place in here to gather their resources without having to fight anybody. Remember that you have the shield wall that stretches for 24 kilometers, and then you have all of these tiles over here that are absolutely way too many to be covered by players at every given moment. Now, another interesting angle that Funcom shown that could potentially turn into a highly lucrative activity is to sell sync charts every single week, given how the Coriolis Storm constantly resets all the deep desert maps, so you have to rediscover them again every week. But if you're the type of player who enjoys exploration or maybe just enjoys going in solo, what you can do is at the start of the weekly reset, you can hop onto your ornithopter and then head over into the deep desert to discover maps of it, and then create sync charts out of the maps that you discovered that you can then trade or sell to other players for a massive profit. Given the fact that not everybody will have the time to constantly do this, you can essentially turn it into a highly lucrative activity and then funnel the profits that you make out of that into endgame items that you normally can get on your own solo in case you're that type of player. We can of course also see the sync chart over here showing all the information relevant to this, including the person who created that, also which region of the desert is mapped, and also how long ago was the sync chart made, so that you know if it's out of date or not. And of course, once the other player also gets it, it's pretty much going to instantly reveal that portion of the deep desert for them without them having to actually travel to that location. So a pretty good method for other players, groups, or guilds to see if there are noteworthy locations for them to go into. Also, very good to note is that the weekly reset or the storm is going to really destroy everything in the deep desert, player bases including, but there is an upside to this, and the main one is that in the deep desert, the cost of building bases is reduced to half of what it normally is. But you're still going to want a forward base over there at the very least, because you're going to be collecting resources. Those need to be processed. You need to craft items such as carry-alls, which obviously cannot be carried into backup tools. So in this case, you're going to need to create that anyway. But this is why those base blueprints become so important over here, especially for an organized guild, for example, or an organized group to immediately start going in with the production needed to actually go in and exploit all of those resources. And that is because pretty much every single endgame item will require those spices. All of the tier 6 and above blueprints will need them. So obviously it's important both to have the manufacturing going on, but also getting the items ready so that you can actually go ahead and collect those resources in the first place. And speaking of that, they've actually shown a spice blow collection, how that looks like in real time. And I'm not gonna lie, it looked even more cinematic than I initially anticipated, despite not featuring any PvP in that scenario. So in this case, it immediately became very clear that there are two vehicles you absolutely need here as a guild to make this as efficient as possible. One is the carry-all, which is the largest version of the ornithopters. This is much more difficult to build than your typical ornithopter, but it also has the capability of transporting other vehicles. And that vehicle is going to be the sandcrawler. This is the main and best way to collect spices from the spice blows. So in this case, using the carry-all, they transported that all over there so that they could begin the harvesting process. But there's another very cool aspect that they've shown, and that is because of all of that commotion, a lot of sandworms will be attracted to the area, so somebody needs to distract them. So what they've done in this case, they've set up a bunch of scouts on the perimeters to constantly set down thumpers to attract the sandworms away from the mining operation, which I found to be just pure genius. Of course, also in tune very much with the lore itself. So having this happening in game just looks absolutely stunning. Of course, you will need those scouts both on the ground and in the air, because dangers can approach from all angles. You can have other players converging on the same location to engage in PvP. You can have the sandworms trying to eat you, but you can also have something like a storm coming in unexpectedly and destroying your whole operation and destroying your vehicles. So high risk, but very high reward nonetheless. Also, on a similar topic, this is not the only way to acquire the spice in the game, mind you. Like they said before, you also have that option to find smaller pockets in the shield wall as well. But beyond that, you can also see, for example, in some of this footage, that there are specific spice merchants that can sell it in some of the major hubs, in this case for 120,000 each, which seems steep, but we played the demo and it was easy to get 100k at level 40, so I'm expecting endgame to actually be even easier, especially if you engage in some other activities as well and maybe a bit of trading. Besides that, Funcom also mentioned that smaller scale spice blows can also happen in Haga Basin, which actually sounds exciting. But beyond that, you also have the player exchange, where inevitably you're going to find extra to buy in case you really need it. Now, like I said, this is not the only endgame activity. In fact, you have many more that are more inclined towards PvE. So we have those ecological sites, the endgame shipwrecks, also some of those control points which are relegated to the weekly Landsraad. More on that in just a little bit. But basically, what you should know about some of these is that the ecological sites are different than the testing stations that we've seen in the early stages, but they still have some similarities. So it's still a dungeon style encounter with many enemies, at the end of which you're typically going to find schematics, unique schematics that can provide very good items. However, the difficulty here is much higher, pretty much tuned for 4 players. And another thing is that some of them may involve some kind of wave-based encounters, so waves of enemies spawning at you at some point. But one cool thing that Funcom mentioned is that they will create more layouts for the ecological sites in the future, so that the random ones that get generated will feature new wings with different aspects or other different themes, I would imagine, but they haven't detailed too much about that. Also, another thing to note is that if there's any future DLCs that introduce new tiers of gear, let's say for example it goes to tier 7 and right now Deep Desert gives tier 6, what will happen is that the Deep Desert will get updated, so now it drops the maximum tier provided by those future DLCs. That's because Deep Desert will always match the endgame and will be the most endgame activity we want to engage into. Also, since we talked about the Landsraad, the weekly policies, not all of it takes place in the Deep Desert, and we know from previous videos that not all of it is PvP related either. In fact, you're going to see a lot of the houses having PvE objectives, such as taking down a certain number of enemies from some outposts, or delivering a number of resources or specific items to those houses' representatives, such as for example vehicles. And we can see over here it being tracked for each of the 25 houses in the Landsraad board. So every time you participate in this, depending on your participation level, or in this case guild participation level, you're going to get different tiers of reward. So we can see that there are typically 5 or 6 such tiers. First at maybe 1,000 points, then like 4,000 points, then 7, 10 and 14,000, and every single tier progressively gives you something that is useful. They seem random, but it can be anything from armors, even like armor swatches. This includes extra coloring, all the way to crafting resources as far as I can tell. So this again depends on your level of participation. So even if your faction doesn't win for that week, at least you get something by completing these weekly objectives. However, if your faction does win for that week, there are some great benefits over here, and one of them that the guilds can vote for within that faction is this Landsraad weapons vendor, and there's supposedly other items vendors that you can call for that week for your faction back at the hub. And we've seen the trailer over here showcasing weapons that are far beyond what you can normally craft on your own. So typically what you get on your own is pretty makeshift and kind of amateur-esque looking, but when you compare them to some of these absolute beasts over here, pretty much weapons of war, there's a completely different theme going on. So definitely something that your guild and your faction will want to strive for, and likely something that will give you bigger advantages later down the line. In any case, another important aspect they've shown, well, they've shown a lot actually in those almost 3 hours of live stream, but in this case, they've shown more of Arakeen, which is basically the player hub for the Atreides faction. In this case, you can go over there either with the ornithopter or by talking to these pilots. If you don't have one, you can find them at any of the trade posts and they will bring you there in exchange for cash, as in you're going to need to have physical money on your character to give it in. It doesn't work on in-game credit. But in this case, there are some important NPCs here we're gonna visit. Of course, we have a number of vendors. One of the vendors even has its own radio station, so it actually talks about the things that it salvages and brings back to its shop in case you want it but don't have the time to visit it. Also, the advanced trainers can be found over here, but probably most important is the exchange and the banking system. In this case, the exchange we've seen before, pretty much the in-game auction house lets you list items or buy items from other players, so you can both make money and also sell your items over here. But the banking system is more important in my opinion, because this lets you deposit items without fearing of losing them whatsoever, as well as credits if you want to. So this is especially important before you take a long break, for example. You can plan on that. Just go ahead and copy your base into a blueprint and then dismantle everything, bring back all of the items, the blueprint and all of the crafting materials over here, and whenever you come back later, you can just resume from where you left off. And this is going to be very useful because you're going to have to pay that in-game tax to the Emperor on your largest bases. And if you forget about that, your base eventually will have its shield removed and eventually will get destroyed by the weather or maybe even other players depending where you left it off. And in this case, you're going to want to pay that, and that's done also right here at the main hub. In this case, we can see that it's only the advanced sub-fiefs that need to be paid for. Funcom mentioned that the smaller sub drop thieves, as well as the ones in the starting areas, don't incur such a tax, so your other bases are safe. But even for the bigger ones, the tax paid over here seems to be really small. I mean, just 2 to 3,000. You kind of have a couple of in-game weeks to also pay these anyway. Plus, on top of that, in the end game, I imagine that 2-3,000 is going to be very easy to come by. Now, on a final note, the only other aspect I want to cover is that they've shown some of the faction skins that you can unlock, and I'm not gonna lie, they look actually really cool, both for your bases and for some of your vehicles. So, for example, when they crafted the Ornithopter, they've shown that once it's fully built, you don't just get to select different swatches, which are basically different color schemes, but also variants. And there were a couple of them, including this one, provided apparently by being fully aligned with the Atreides. So in this case, I think it looks really awesome. It completely changes how it looks, even though components wise it's exactly the same build, but those aesthetics over there are definitely much cooler. And similarly, it also goes for your base. Once you get high enough standing with whichever house you align yourself with, you're going to unlock the base building structures in the theme of that specific house. So not only are these going to provide and expand upon what you can create, they look much better than the glorified matchboxes that we created in the beta, because that's the only thing we got access to. Of course, this is not the only way to acquire them. You can actually find a lot of other decorations from a lot of the vendors in the game at trading posts and whatnot. Plus, quite a lot of them are given from Twitch drop campaigns in the future, including some of the circular iron windows and ceilings that they've shown at some point in the game. But obviously, it's likely that there will be many more. But this pretty much concludes today's video. Yeah, lots of information over here, so let me know down below in the comments if any of this has put your mind at ease, especially in regards to the endgame of Dune Awakening. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.